I didn't realize how tightly I had been holding my breath until that night. It wasn't my chest that hurt. It was something deeper. Something that had been pressing against me for months without giving me a moment to exhale. The house felt colder than usual, not because of the temperature, but because silence had taken over every room. He had walked past me again without looking up from his phone, muttering something that didn't sound like a greeting and didn't feel like one either. I answered anyway, hoping for a thread of connection, and got nothing in return. It was the same pattern I kept pretending not to notice, until I couldn't anymore. That I tried sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the heaviness to pass, but it only grew heavier. Every unanswered conversation, every careless shrug, every night spent pretending things were fine, they all piled up until I felt as if the walls were leaning in. I stepped outside because it was the only place left that didn't echo back the weight of what had been happening. Even the air outside felt too still, as if the world paused just long enough for me to realize how tired I truly was. I leaned against the railing, trying to pull in steady breaths, but each inhale trembled. I kept telling myself it was just stress, just fatigue, just another phase. But deep down I knew it was more than that. When someone you share a life with stops seeing you, the loneliness becomes louder than any argument. And that night it was deafening. I didn't hear footsteps approaching. I just heard someone say my name softly, in a tone I hadn't heard in a long time, concern, not obligation. I turned, and he stood there with a question in his eyes before he said anything. He wasn't someone special to me before that moment, just familiar enough to recognize, distant enough to never cross into my life. But the way he looked at me made something inside loosen, like he had noticed the struggle I had tried so hard to hide. That he asked if I was all right, and for a second I didn't know how to answer. No one had asked me that with genuine worry for months. I tried brushing it off, but he didn't move, didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence with pointless words. He simply stayed there, waiting, giving me space to breathe without pushing me to explain anything. That small act felt like a lifeline I didn't even know I was reaching for. I finally managed to say I was fine, but he didn't believe it. He didn't challenge me either. Instead, he asked if I wanted to sit for a moment, just to catch my breath. The gentleness in his voice startled me more than anything else. I wasn't used to being spoken to like that anymore. I wasn't used to being noticed. I didn't know why it mattered so much, or why the simple presence of someone who cared enough to stay made my chest loosen for the first time that night. All I knew was that the suffocating pressure I had carried for so long eased, just slightly, and it surprised me more than anything he could have said. I kept replaying that moment in my mind for days, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his expression, the way he had waited patiently, the quiet concern that made me feel unexpectedly safe. I started noticing small things about him, the way his voice carried calmness, the subtle way he listened without interrupting, the patience that felt almost foreign compared to the hurried dismissals I'd grown used to. Each memory left me unsettled in the best possible way. A mixture of longing and guilt that I couldn't quite name. A few days later, I ran into him again. It was accidental, almost like the universe was nudging me toward something I wasn't ready to understand. He smiled when he saw me, but it wasn't just a polite smile. It was warm, steady, and somehow familiar. We began talking lightly at first about ordinary things, work, the weather, nothing of consequence. But even in small talk there was a rhythm, a comfort I hadn't felt in months. I found myself sharing thoughts I usually buried, hints of frustration and exhaustion I thought no one else could grasp. Our conversation drifted effortlessly, and I realized I hadn't been this open with anyone for a long time. He never pried, never pushed, but he asked the right questions, the ones that made me examine my own feelings without judgment. It felt dangerous in a way because I knew how easily my heart could get pulled toward the solace he offered. Yet it wasn't physical. It was emotional. A vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. And in that space I felt alive, awake, and seen. Every interaction became a small escape from the heaviness that had taken over my life. He never demanded anything, never insinuated anything, yet the tension between comfort and desire was palpable. I started noticing moments when I craved his attention, when the silence at home made me ache for the ease of his presence. It was intoxicating in the quietest sense, subtle enough that I could deny its power but persistent enough that ignoring it was impossible. I knew the line I was crossing, even if it was just emotional. I felt a mix of guilt and thrill, a push and pull that left me unsettled yet aware of what I had been missing. No one had asked me how I felt in so long. No one had waited. No one had noticed that I was struggling to breathe in my own life. And suddenly, the thought of walking away from him, even just for a moment, felt like leaving behind the only person who truly understood. The day ended with a lingering moment neither of us broke, a silence filled with more meaning than words could capture. I walked away shaken, but also aware of a truth I hadn't wanted to admit. He had become my anchor, the one who reminded me that I deserved to be seen, to be heard, to exist without constantly suppressing myself. And for the first time in months, I realized that maybe I had been holding my breath not just from neglect, but from forgetting how it felt to be noticed, to be understood, to be alive in someone's presence without fear or expectation. The tension at home was unbearable, though I had grown used to it. Every glance, every word from him seemed sharper than necessary, a reminder that our connection had frayed beyond repair. I tried to ignore it, pretending that I could still breathe in the space that was supposed to feel like mine, but the truth kept pressing in. Each night I felt the same suffocating weight, and no amount of pretending could lift it. I realized that the loneliness I carried was no longer about him. It was about me and what I had allowed myself to accept, and those moments, thoughts of him, the one who had noticed me, crept into my mind with unexpected force. I found myself longing for the calm he offered, the steady presence that made my chest loosen when the world at home felt unmanageable. Our conversations, though few and carefully measured, became lifelines I couldn't ignore. It wasn't about anything physical. It was about being seen, understood, and held in a way I had almost forgotten existed. One night, after another argument that left the air heavy with words unsaid, I reached a breaking point. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The suffocation I felt wasn't just emotional. It had become a tangible weight pressing on my lungs. I needed clarity, a moment to catch my breath, and I knew the only place I could find it was with him. I reached out, almost impulsively, asking if he could meet me. There was hesitation in his tone, a careful awareness of boundaries, but he agreed. When I saw him again, it was like stepping into a space where my thoughts could finally be untangled. I admitted everything, the exhaustion, the frustration, the feeling of invisibility that had been gnawing at me for months. I let the tears come, unashamed and raw, because I knew he wouldn't judge me. He didn't try to offer solutions or tell me what to do. He simply listened, steady and present, allowing me to feel what I had ignored for too long. That night, I realized I had crossed an emotional boundary I hadn't intended to. I wasn't betraying anyone physically, but my trust, my reliance, my vulnerability were all leaning in the direction of someone else. The weight of that realization was sharp, but it was accompanied by a strange clarity. For the first time, I understood that my desperation to breathe had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the neglect I had endured elsewhere. He didn't try to take advantage of the moment. Instead, he stayed quiet when I needed silence, offered comfort when I needed support, and reminded me, without saying it outright, that I was allowed to exist outside of the limitations others had imposed on me. That night ended with a simple act, small and unassuming, that surprised me more than anything. It wasn't dramatic or excessive, but it was enough to show me that care, attention, and understanding could exist without condition. For the first time in months, I felt something that resembled hope. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The weight that had pressed down on me for so long had lifted just enough for me to see things plainly. The night before had been a turning point, not because of anything dramatic, but because of a simple act of care that reminded me of my own worth. I realized that I had allowed myself to be trapped in a space where my emotions were constantly dismissed, where my voice was barely heard, and where I had stopped noticing my own needs. The surprising thing he had done, staying present, offering quiet support, letting me release without expectation, had shown me something I had almost forgotten. I deserved to be seen and understood. It wasn't about him or my partner. It was about reclaiming the right to exist fully, to acknowledge my own feelings, and to take action when my well-being was at stake. I carried that awareness with me into the day, feeling both lighter and more determined than I had in a long time. I knew I couldn't ignore the situation at home any longer. I confronted him, not with anger but with honesty. I admitted the distance, the frustration, and the suffocating pattern we had fallen into together. I spoke about how invisible I had felt, how our relationship had become more about routine than connection, and how much I had needed someone to notice me. It wasn't easy, and he didn't respond perfectly, but for the first time there was space for acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Even if it didn't fix everything immediately, it was a start. The other man stepped back gracefully, never imposing, never demanding. His role had never been to replace or disrupt, but to remind me of my own breathing room, to show me that care and understanding could exist outside of obligation. That gesture, the restraint, the quiet respect, taught me more about boundaries and self-respect than months of trying to force attention at home had ever done. I realized that emotional infidelity, even when unacted upon physically, was a wake-up call, not a conclusion. It was a mirror showing me where I had stopped valuing myself and a nudge to reclaim that space. By the evening, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. I could breathe without thinking about who was noticing me or whether anyone cared. I reflected on how close I had come to losing myself in the struggle, and I acknowledged that the suffocating night had been the catalyst for change. I had been given a moment to confront my own needs, to face the reality of my relationship, and to take the first steps toward being seen again. I understood that what had happened wasn't about guilt or betrayal. It was about recognition, honesty, and reclaiming the right to feel fully alive. That night had reminded me that even in the darkest, most suffocating moments, care and understanding could appear unexpectedly, and that realization could change everything. I had finally learned that sometimes the act of breathing again isn't about someone saving you. It's about allowing yourself to be noticed, to be heard, and to choose your own life with clarity and courage.